panel number 4, which is on handling mass demonstrations. I'd like to welcome you all back. And we have 4 panelists for this. I'd like to introduce now Kristina Brown, who's a member of Black Lives Matter Cincinnati. Welcome. Next to her, Garry McCarthy, Superintendent of the Chicago Police Department. Rodney Monroe, Chief of Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. And Whent, Chief of the Oakland Police Department. And let's start with Kristina Brown.
Good afternoon. As previously stated, my name is Kristina Brown, and I have just a couple prefaces or housekeeping rules. It's Kristina with the CH, not a K, so if you want to find me on Facebook, that won't work. And also, given the recent commentary before this and just taking notes, I have updated my testimony so it won't accurately be reflected in the documents that you have, but that's just a little bit of information. So yes, greetings to the members of the President's 21st Century Task Force on Policing. My name is Kristina Brown. I'm a founding organizer of Black Lives Matter Cincinnati. This initiative arose to address the local void in Black millennial actions in response to local and national police protests to state violence, particularly police violence. I make mention of this not because I am here on behalf of Black Lives Matter Cincinnati. I'm actually here on behalf of myself, a young Black millennial who is affected on a day-to-day basis by community policing. I also state this because it is important that as we sit here, both as participants and as listeners, that we understand that Black Lives Matter is at the heart of most demonstrations that are taking place throughout the country. I must confess that it was somewhat difficult to provide policy recommendations on mass demonstrations because at first we must understand that there is a culture of violence against communities of colors that are leading to the demonstrations themselves. Inability to understand and empathize with the context in which these anti-police brutalities demonstrations are taking place is within itself a systemic failure. Dispatching officers whose leadership believes that most demonstrators are merely race baiters or conspiracy theorists, it further perpetuates the cycle of distrust that makes Black and brown communities incredibly invulnerable. While this may not play out in the literal spaces in which demonstrations occur, it's emanated in the public comments made by law enforcement officers, their union representatives, and anti-activist sentiments. So today I insist that mass demonstrations and community policing as an ideology must be navigated through the context of 3 lenses. 1, interpersonal gentility. 2, individual officer restraint. And 3, criminal justice institutional reform. When these 3 concepts are adequately balanced, mass demonstrations can healthily occur, reducing the potential to escalate tensions between communities of color and police. Today I've provided a few recommendations to implement when navigating massive demonstrations that are taking place. My institutional recommendations for policy are as follows. 1, eliminate the usage of military-grade equipment during demonstrations, especially within the urban core. Not only does the imagery of military-grade equipment in these neighborhoods trigger historical trauma between Black and brown communities of color, according to the American Civil Liberties Union, there is disparate impact on communities of color when militarization takes place in these neighborhoods. 2, during times of visible tension between police and communities of color, reduce and suspend enforcement of minor violations. This idea of broken windows and hyper-policing only perpetuates this idea that selective enforcement takes place only in Black and brown neighborhoods against Black and brown people. So during these tense times, it's important to operate with flexibility and maneuverability to address the needs of the protesters. My 3rd recommendation would be to advise elected officials to only deploy National Guard and enforce martial law in response to mass violence, not in anticipation of agitation or of mass demonstration. We can recently point to Governor Jay Nixon in Ferguson, Missouri, who days before the release of the announcement in the Darren Wilson case kept perpetually stating that he would deploy National Guard once the decision was announced. And this did not necessarily make protesters feel safer. It penetrated them as an act of intimidation from the state. So in order to create this culture of trust that we're all working towards, it's important that this be considered. Fourth recommendation is to inform law enforcement to remove riot gear and maintain neutral stances during demonstrations. Sometimes the tension is unspoken, and I'm sure we've all seen memes that have floated around social media that have stated Birmingham 1963, no, Ferguson 2014. So it's important for the police who are on site at these demonstrations to maintain an open posture despite some of the visible tension that lingers. My fifth recommendation is to anticipate traffic disruptions, reroute traditional traffic, and only create protest barriers here when necessary for protest safety. In December, there was a mass demonstration that took place downtown at our federal courthouse. It eventually led from the federal courthouse to the opening of a freeway. The police were incredibly fluid and helpful in terms of rerouting traffic and not issuing excessive force towards the demonstrators. And that level of flexibility was incredibly important to maintain the calm demeanor of the protest. My final policy recommendation would be to, when possible, identify leadership within mass demonstrations and primarily communicate through representatives, especially when there is a possibility of arrest or a deployment of force. If anyone recently viewed the protest that took place at the Mall of America, there was a mega screen that was taken over by the security, and they basically amplified instructions which further agitated the demonstrators. So whenever possible, using interpersonal communication as opposed to mass communication, which appears to be a form of intimidation, is recommended. While I am simply one of many leaders in the countless movement of others, I've noted from both personal experience and from afar what the consequences of ignoring these considerations, how they may play out. As a protester, I've witnessed police successfully allow mass demonstrations to temporarily disrupt traffic, only to regroup and lawfully dissemble. But I've also witnessed police aggressively forewarn protesters against exercising their First Amendment rights, which is completely unacceptable. I express these sentiments not to evoke sympathy for the masses, but to ensure that consideration is given to those who might otherwise be targets of state and police violence. Before I close, I'd like to leave you with a paraphrased quote from the Ohio Student Association, which is an organization who organizes on behalf of millennials of color. They stated, after meeting with President Obama in November, that task forces are where the concerns of the community go to die. I challenge you, the task force, to make sure that the concerns of the community do not die, and I am confident that we can truly alter the state of 21st century policing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Superintendent McCarthy?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here. Like Kristina said, my comments are a little bit different than what I submitted because unfortunately they were submitted so quickly. I had to change them before I got here. What I'd like to speak about in the world of mass demonstrations is our experience in Chicago. And the best example that I could give you where we developed strategies and tactics regarding these demonstrations goes back to September of 2011, when I was informed that the NATO summit would take place in Chicago in May of 2012. And this became a massive and daunting task to plan, train, and equip our entire department of 13,000 officers. And our goal, obviously, was to maintain the security of the city and attendees while addressing potentially thousands of protesters and preparing for all of that in a very short 8-month period. Our stated goal from the beginning was to protect the protesters' right to free speech while preventing criminal behavior. Very simple concept, sometimes very difficult in an operational fashion. We did have some experience that we could draw upon and test some techniques during the Occupy movement, particularly, obviously, Occupy Chicago. And it was during that we developed perhaps our most important policy, which was a decision based upon the recognition that confrontation begets confrontation. And I think I'm echoing Ms. Brown's comments at this point. We developed a plan to train our officers and equip our officers around something that we call the soft look, which the police executives in the audience know what I'm talking about. It's the normal police officer uniform. We did not come out in riot gear. I also changed the use of force continuum for the Chicago Police Department in that only I could authorize the use of tear gas during one of those events. And we also developed strategies and tactics that revolved around the use of bicycles, which turned out to be a lot less confrontational, and at the same time, they're very mobile, they're very fluid, and you have a built-in barrier that you can use when you have a bike in front of you. So to develop these strategies and tactics and plan, the training that the department underwent was extensive. And what is it that we studied? We studied the history of civil disorder, legal perspectives, team tactics, demonstrator tactics, crowd dynamics, personal protective equipment, riot control agents, less than lethal munitions, shield and baton training, use of force continuums, the long-range acoustic device, the LRAD, suspicious package response, mass arrest, flex cuffing, medical and rescue training, field force extrication, and scenario-based training concerning the use of crowd control formations. And crowd control is a very significant phrase during this conversation, because that's our goal. It's crowd control, and that plays into our tactics. The delivery of our training was not just classroom and hands-on training, but the entire department went through training bulletins, e-learning modules, and streaming videos concerning crowd control-related topics. The appropriate and reasonable amount of force was a central focus to our training, which we applied during the NATO summit. As I stated, I changed the policy regarding the use of tear gas, and I also changed the policy regarding the use of the LRAD, that only I could authorize its use. And much like Kristina said, the reasonable use of military equipment is something that's critical in these situations. And while we need to have it available in the case of some sort of catastrophic event, there's no reason for a rifle or an armored car to be on the front lines of a demonstration. Because make no mistake about it, the police can turn a protest into a riot. The team concept was instilled into the training courses for NATO because successful team tactics, tactical operations, rely on the creation of a well-disciplined, professional, and controlled working team. Strong leadership and supervision were required for our success. We reinforced the fact that supervisors will be held strictly accountable for their personnel. And in one of the previous panels, I heard the discussion about whether or not somebody intervenes when an officer is getting too hot. And during the NATO training and during the actual NATO event, when officers who were being subjected to verbal taunts for a long period of time showed that they were starting to get a little bit excited, supervisors would step in, remove them from the line, and replace them with another officer. That's something that we did on a constant basis. We also trained with outside agencies, and Rodney Monroe, my friend sitting to my right, Charlotte-Mecklenburg, was there. Philadelphia loaned us a mobile field force for the summit. But we trained together, we worked together so that we could work seamlessly. We also conducted command staff tabletop exercises to practice what we had learned. At this point, the tactics and strategies that we used have put us in a position where the Chicago Police Department is being recognized nationally and internationally as a police department for best practices concerning crowd control because of how our department handled the NATO and performed during the NATO summit. We worked well together, showed patience and discipline, and our police lines were impenetrable when confrontation became inevitable at one point. Once the NATO summit left Chicago in 2012, we critiqued and looked at the lessons learned. And the simple strategy of that soft look, the simplest idea that confrontation begets confrontation, was identified as the single most important factor in our planning, training, and execution of what happened during NATO, which, at the risk of being accused of sucking up to one of the board members, this takes us to legitimacy and procedural justice. And the lessons learned during NATO, we now translated to what we do on an everyday basis on patrol. And we developed, with the help of Tracy Mears and Tom Tyler, a comprehensive training for our entire department regarding legitimacy and procedural justice. I don't have to tell you about the aspects of that, but at this point, the entire department has been trained in legitimacy and procedural justice, and we're now actually moving into a second phase of that training that people are coming to see all across the country. By fostering an environment where procedural justice and legitimacy principles become standard practice, police departments can create an organizational culture that fosters a true partnership with the public. In concert with our legitimacy and procedural justice training, the Chicago Police Department continues to conduct crowd control sustainment training in order to keep officers' knowledge and skills fresh that they exhibited and learned before and during the NATO summit of 2012. In short, these are perishable skills that, if they're not refreshed on a regular basis, will in fact go away. And at this point, just like every place else in the country, there continue to be large protests on a regular basis in the city of Chicago regarding a large array of topics. There were usually minimal arrests, and most protests remained peaceful. So, in summary, what is it that we did right? What is it that we learned? First of all, our goal is to protect the First Amendment rights of the protesters while preventing criminal activity. We plan, train, equip our officers, we supervise, and lead from the bottom, from the front. The tactics that we used, really simple. Confrontation begets confrontation. We went with the soft look, and when we had to, when they started throwing rocks and bottles, we went to helmets. When they attacked us, then we went to riot gear. So there were 3 levels of confrontation and different ways that we dealt with it. Very effective use of our bicycle teams, very important for effective mass demonstration execution. Extraction techniques. In other words, you will never see the Chicago Police Department during my tenure wholesale wade into a crowd. You will never ever see that. When individuals would throw rocks or bottles, extraction teams would remove that individual from the protest, and the rest of the protest would continue on peacefully. Military equipment, such as armored vehicles and rifles, should never be present at demonstrations. As I said, the police can very easily turn a protest into a riot. Lastly, we used crowd control techniques and patience, not tear gas, to avoid escalating a confrontation. Due to the crowd control training and practice that our officers receive continually, the department focused on constitutional rights, the appropriate and reasonable amount of force applied during mass demonstrations, teamwork, procedural justice, and legitimacy culture within our department is expanding. The leadership of the department being held accountable strictly for the behavior of subordinates is bringing us effective results. Everything that we do matters. Everything becomes a teachable moment, every single interaction. And the lessons that we learned during mass demonstrations in Chicago, we've been able to translate into our everyday strategies. And just ending 2014, we had a reduction in crime. We had a reduction in complaints against our officers. We made 15,000 less arrests while reducing that crime. We increased our clearance rates for our detectives all at the same time. So we're getting the best of all worlds by engaging in these behaviors and learning from them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Superintendent McCarthy. Chief Monroe.
Good afternoon, everyone. As stated, I'm Rodney Monroe, Chief of Police at Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department in North Carolina. I'm honored to be here today to share my views and recommendations with this esteemed task force, also as it relates to mass demonstrations. I think you'll hear a common theme amongst us this afternoon, because I think each and every one of us has shared our thoughts, our training, and a lot of other resources as it relates to dealing with mass demonstrations. As many of you are aware, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department in 2012 hosted the Democratic National Convention in North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina. We had one overarching philosophy as it related to that particular convention, and that was to provide a safe environment for all attendees, demonstrators, citizens, and officers to ensure that the democratic process was able to vet itself out in a peaceful and orderly manner. CMPDs wanted the DNC to be the story, not the operations or the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department in itself. With an estimated 35,000 convention attendees and over 6,000 delegates, governors, thousands of security personnel, over 15,000 media personnel, we knew that we would be the center of attention for those 6 days. However, our training and our preparation began way before that September 6th opening of the Democratic National Convention. 18 months prior to that particular event, the CMPD began its preparations as relates to how we saw fit to handle this massive event that was taking place. Looking at the history of the conventions, looking at the tone of what was going on around the country and around the world were significant influences as it relates to our preparedness for this. What we learned is, and what we continue to employ today, is that training. Clearly understanding is not just a one-time training opportunity, but the training that you can actually derive from being progressive in the way that you look at engaging communities and the public not only helps you in handling those particular situations, but as Garry mentioned, it helps you prepare your officers for daily engagements with the community. I'd like to kind of steer away from my written comments and more or less focus on our philosophy in general. Whether you're managing demonstrations or events with 50 people or 5,000 people, the attendees expect to have a safe and happy experience as it relates to that particular event. Training being the key component of our preparation, it must occur beforehand and it must be continuous even in the absence of events. The foundation of our training began with how do we facilitate the peaceful and lawful demonstrations by utilizing tactics and engagement that keep the demonstrators, the public, and officers safe. That training included various topics, not only tactical topics, but command structure. How do you engage from the command level? How every level of command has a distinct responsibility of oversight as it relates to the demonstration. The engagement with demonstrators, and I'm not just talking about the tactical engagement, but the conversations with the organizers and participants of the demonstration, not just during the event, but months and weeks beforehand, and even after the event itself. The various legal aspects, how do you protect and go up against and support the First Amendment rights of all demonstrators? How do you recognize the peaceful nature of the majority of the demonstrators and facilitate your training around those things? And your training must encompass not only field training, but online training, the ability to tabletop exercises throughout the period before and after and during to make sure that you're putting forth the proper techniques for handling these situations safely. Training should not be self-taught. We believe that there are other experienced professionals out there, whether in the local, state, or federal arena that can support you in these particular endeavors. And one of the key components and elements of that training has to be your community. The communities need to be involved in that training and helping you better understand the dynamics associated with those that will be engaged in those activities. Researching and sharing the best practices. We visited Chicago, we visited Boston, we visited Washington, D.C., and a number of other cities that had engaged in these type of activities before so that we could gain best practices to bring back to Charlotte. The use of technology as it relates to cameras, being able to get ahead of situations and understanding the dynamics that are associated with that event provide a tremendous benefit to you. The span of control as it relates to officer to supervisor ratio. We utilize a very short span of control, 1 to 9 officers throughout the event. We utilize various resources. As Garry stated, our initial response throughout the majority of the events was officers in regular uniforms, then layered with officers on bicycles, then layered with the use of small motorized motorcycles for quick movement throughout the city. Then came the mobile field forces and the civil disturbance units, which all of those units were kept out of sight of the general public. They were pre-staged around the city at critical infrastructures, locations in which potential problems could occur, but fortunately, through the management of all the events, those resources were not used. Your resources need to be fluid in a manner in which that they can be deployed. I agree with Garry wholeheartedly that we're not in the business of putting forth a military presence during any of these demonstrations. One of the things that we developed in our crown banishment scenarios is breaking down every element of the demonstration. From a lawful assembly where persons look to exercise their First Amendment activity through speeches, picketing, marches, assemblies, protests. Our response, action, monitor and assess that crowd behavior without interfering with the activity, maintain neutrality and focus on potential criminal behavior, not the message of the participants, maintain tolerance even if taunted or baited, don't overreact, but maintain readiness to respond should violence occur. Establish and maintain communication with event organizers throughout. And do not interfere with media or other recordings of those events. Nonviolent civil disobedience. Traditional nonviolent protests, whether it's sit-ins, blocking traffic, blocking entrances, or spontaneous marching in the street. Our response, monitor and assess the crowd behavior without interfering with lawful activity, record and document the acts of civil disobedience, do not interfere with lawful activity, seek voluntary compliance or timetable for that compliance, do not lock into one position or stance, remain fluid and ready to respond, reroute traffic if feasible, issue warnings before any police action with emphasis on waiting out disobedience. If police actions are needed, are necessary, instruct on what that process is, and again, seek compliance. No use of force can be used or will be used without approval of a supervisor. Isolated violent behavior. Isolate that physical violence against persons or property, whether throwing objects, smashing windows, does not include the verbal taunting or use of offensive speech against officers. Use organizers as our response to monitor and gain voluntary compliance. Identify and track key suspects, and as Garry mentioned, extract those agitators separately. Videotape the recordings of individual and police actions. If possible, arrest suspects away from the group and immediately remove from the area. This is the continuum that we use within the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department for handling all demonstrations, including mass demonstrations. After our DNC convention, we had an organization, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, commissioned CNA to come in to do an after-action report on the convention. Because when we started preparing for the convention, there was no written document for us to use. But since then, both from Tampa and Charlotte, an after-action report was delivered to us, as well as being shared for all the individuals that have the upcoming conference coming. And one of their observations in the after-action report pointed to the use of technology as a force multiplier, being able to get out in front of issues and incidents before they got out of control. The deploying of police leadership in the field that could engage demonstrators, as well as reacting quickly to any issue that occurred throughout the demonstration. So therefore, in closing, in preparation, communication is the key. Communicating your purpose was key to us in allowing demonstrators to understand our position and for us to understand theirs. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Chief Monroe. Chief Whent?
All right, good afternoon. I'll be brief because many of my remarks would actually be redundant of things that all three of the other panelists have said. But Oakland, particularly over the last, well, the Bay Area traditionally has been has a rich tradition of protest activity and exercising First Amendment rights. So it's given the Oakland Police Department a fair degree of experience with this, of which we learn from constantly. Going back to Occupy, where we certainly learned from our lessons of what not to do. More recently, I think we've learned what to do, and part of that has been working with, learning from other organizations and how they do things. But I will highlight some of the aspects of our policy which I think are particularly important, starting with, obviously, all members strictly adhere to an incident command system. For citations in lieu of arrest, many of the offenses that we would actually make arrests for during mass demonstration operations are misdemeanors, and our typical policy there is to make every effort to cite out individuals at a safe location near the place of arrest. We set up a mobile booking station to process prisoners. Persons with no identification, warrants, or felony charges are taken into physical custody. But this has significantly reduced the amount of time to process prisoners and significantly reduced complaints. Regarding use of force in mass demonstration activities, we have very strict controls on the use of force, as has been mentioned before. We do not use baton jabs to move a crowd. The use of any baton or any weapon must meet the department's standard use of force policy, including elements such as level of threat faced, what the want was, offense that you're trying to arrest somebody for. Specialty impact weapons have a higher threshold for use in crowd control situations, and the use of tear gas can only be deployed when ordered at the incident commander level. Regarding mutual aid, we have all mutual aid agencies report to a staging area, so they do not self-deploy. At the staging area, mutual aid agencies are briefed on OPD policy and procedure for crowd control. Each of those outside agency teams is assigned an OPD officer to act as a radio operator, pathfinder liaison to OPD. We take an inventory of outside agency less lethal munitions and weapons at the staging area both before and after the event. And it is our attempt to use mutual aid agencies as force protection or force projection. And if they are put into a skirmish line position, that they use it as a blocking force so that it uses OPD to make physical arrests if that's necessary. We have a very robust body-worn camera program, and during mass demonstration incidents, we have all of our officers activate their cameras while they are engaged with the crowd, and similarly, we also do videotaping of the crowd and our officers. All officers on the department receive training at least once a year on crowd control, and commanders receive training 2 to 3 times a year, including lessons learned from previous events and tabletop exercises. All of our commanders are specifically trained on proper gas plans, and those plans are communicated to gas deployment officers So this would include specific number of devices, the type of device to be used, location of deployment. All that must be determined and communicated before any deployment. So the idea is to prevent any indiscriminate use of tear gas. Regarding vehicles, for moving mobile field forces around or moving officers around for crowd control operations, we use 10-passenger vans, we use large SUVs, motorcycles, bicycles, patrol cars. We do not use armored vehicles for crowd control. If there is some specific threat that would indicate the need for an armored vehicle, it would be parked away from the protest and hidden from view. Also similar to what other agencies have said, we delay the use of riot gear until a situation has gotten to the point where that's actually necessary. We start off with officers in a more soft look. Additionally, we do make use of undercover officers to safely facilitate the arrest of violent individuals during large crowd demonstrations. The undercover officer team are assigned their own arrest team. Undercover officers do not take any direct action or make arrests. They coordinate the arrests of offenders who have completed acts of vandalism or violence. And as a practice, the plan is to make those arrests away from the crowd so as to prevent the crowd from attempting to lynch a prisoner or starting a flashpoint within the crowd. Beyond that, I think it would be duplicative of what everybody else said, but we are committed to a crowd control response that is balanced and constitutional. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Chief. Thanks to all of the panelists. And let me start the questioning with Jose Lopez, followed by Tracy Mears.
Great, thank you. First question for Kristina with the CH. So
We're friends now.
so you came in and understood, immediately said it was incredibly difficult to come in and just think about proposing recommendations on this very focused kind of issue of oversight of mass demonstration, and talked about how we have to remember that those protests came as a result of injustice. So I do want to give you, because of your work with Black Lives Matter and working with young people in Cincinnati, I do want to give you a quick minute to maybe highlight one or two recommendations on the broader theme of today, which is policy and oversight, that you would hope gets implemented through this process.
Thank you for the opportunity to highlight that. I actually participated in an educational series last week in which we had a Cincinnati public school teacher discuss almost a militarization of police in her school. Students' backpacks are being searched without their consent, property is being seized by Cincinnati police officers, and this is their introduction to community policing. Right, so when we talk about mass demonstrations and what brings people to the streets, these forms of microaggressions are what bring people to mass demonstrations. So maybe a larger policy highlight would be, one, ending the pipeline to prison school system. That includes reforming educational systems, but reforming the way police are presented, particularly in urban school districts with high poverty rates and high crime. Another, I guess, policy to consider would be, another policy to consider would be the people who organized here in Cincinnati were reacting very specifically to the history of Cincinnati, which in 2001 we had the civil unrest in which 3 years, 15 black men were killed in the presence of Cincinnati police, but mostly reacting in the response to the lack of judicial enforcement of those killings. So the larger policy conversation would be around special prosecution of these cases and grand jury selections. So those are two vastly different components in terms of what creates the climates for mass demonstrations, but two very intricately connected ideas that bring people to the streets. So hopefully that was somewhat coherent, but those are things that we've discussed as individuals who, feel unheard. So the mass demonstrations are a form of feeling heard in a system that isn't designed to hear us.
Tracy Mears?
Very coherent, thank you. Actually, it was really heartening to listen to each one of you talk about best practices for law enforcement handling of mass demonstrations, but also the fact that many of these best practices, if not all of them, have been implemented on the ground in real life. Which brings me to my question. I think any one of the police executives could answer this question, but since it's going to be a slightly unfair question, I'm going to put Superintendent McCarthy on the spot, since we know each other. Okay, and so here it is. Look, you three clearly know what to do and how to do it, to the point that Kristina was even high-fiving you on the panel. I just want that noted for those of you in the back. But obviously, that's not what happens in so many other locales. And so I guess here's the unfair question. Could you speculate about why that is? Is it just a matter of people not knowing best practices? Is it a function of resources, that it's really expensive to go through these intricate kinds of trainings? Is it some other thing that I can't imagine? Because it seems like this is happening all over the country, so I don't understand why it couldn't happen in Ferguson, Missouri.
So, yes, that's an unfair question, but I'll take a shot at it. I think that all of your speculative comments are correct in that, is it not written down somewhere? No, it's not. Is it that it's expensive? Yes, it is. But I think, we've had this discussion a few times around tables at major city chiefs or PERF, where how do we get these best practices into smaller departments across the country? And what happened in Ferguson was a tiered, layered response of mutual aid. And direction from the top, I think, was missing from the beginning. The event was not taken control of. There was no transparency regarding the shooting, which led to a vacuum, which led to rumors filling it. And then the actual practice of how the demonstrations were handled, I think we're all embarrassed by, quite frankly, in law enforcement. I sat there aghast watching it. The simplest issue of the use of tear gas. In my book, if you fire tear gas, you've got a riot now. You don't have a demonstration. So I don't know if there's I guess I have to be sensitive when I say this, if there's a political gain in some communities for handling different events in different fashions. I certainly know that the mood of Chicago has it that they're expecting professional policing. We've certainly proved it. Going into the NATO summit, all I kept hearing about were the ghosts of the 1968 Democratic Convention in the city of Chicago. Wow. And I could tell you this, that probably 60% of the officers who took place were not even born in 1968 during the NATO summit in 2012. So I think there's legacy that goes along with it. I think there's a lack of recognition of best practices. And I think that the training that goes along with doing this properly. I mean, we trained with the Philly guys. We trained with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg guys. Rodney came up to Chicago and was looking at the practices that we were using. And this is our challenge in law enforcement, is how do we get this to the 17,000 police departments in the country? And like Charlie Beck was saying, and I agree with him, this is your task, and it's a very important one. And I commend you for doing what you're doing, and I hope that we can help and get it done.
Sean Smoot, followed by Cedric Alexander.
Well, actually, that was my exact question. Exactly. So I'll just take a second and thank Superintendent McCarthy and Chief Monroe, because I was at both of the events that you described, and the men and women that you lead were just excellent all the way through. And so thank you for your leadership and your forward thinking on this.
Cedric Alexander.
Yes, thank you. Tracy pointed out something that was I think, pretty obvious to all of us. When Ms. Brown started out with her remarks and observations and clear, very well thought out experiences as it relates to issues that have been very relevant. More recently, it's really historical, quite frankly, in terms of this is not new with communities of color and police, but we have made tremendous gains over the years. So your observations are very well noted in terms of how you feel and what you relay, as many people across this country certainly do feel the same way that you do, Ms. Brown. But what I really found really fascinating after your remarks, three very well-known, respected law enforcement officials who come from three very well-known, respected communities in this nation as well, too, clearly articulated and demonstrated what it is that police do very right and very good. And this is something that I don't believe any of them just came up with. They clearly stated through their own experiences and certainly in recent years of how to best manage crowds when you need to and a process to it. Superintendent McCarthy, you said something I thought were very courageous, and I want to applaud you on this, where you mentioned, quote, police can turn a peaceful civil demonstration into a riot. And I think it's, and I'm very welcome of you saying that, because there are a lot of jurisdictions across the country, large, small, and in between, that may not necessarily believe that. But I think someone of your distinguished background and reputation being able to say that has to be very duly noted, and I think it should create, I hope, some conversations for communities that need to realize that, yes, we can create those kind of environments intentionally, unintentionally. At the end of the day, the results are the same. But when you stated we must plan, train, and supervise personnel, those are clearly three very important elements to have its success when it comes to civil unrest anywhere in this country as well, too. So I don't really have a question as much as a comment that I think it really needs to be noted that the four of you are saying the same thing, and you're doing it in a way that I think this nation needs to see and hear, and just did, in terms of how we move forward and recommendations that you all are making. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I mean that sincerely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cedric Alexander. And our last questioner is going to be Roberto Villasenor.
Good afternoon. I just have a real quick practitioner's question, I guess, more. We've learned the same lessons you have, and probably through trial and error, and the issue of dressing soft for these events. And I heard with very keen interest you say, okay, when the rocks and bottles start, we get helmets. When the attacks start, we bring out the hardcore gear. How are you managing that, or does this cost more to you? Do you keep a whole separate force? Or at that point, things are starting to lose a little control. Do you pull some of your force back to dress out? How are you doing that, I guess is my question.
Well,
Go ahead.
from the perspective of the DNC, we pre-position resources throughout Charlotte, and part of those resources were individuals that were fully prepared for the worst case scenario, but they stayed out of sight. We pre-positioned them at various critical locations, areas that we thought were tipping points throughout the demonstrations, throughout the marches. But with the strict adherence to that they weren't to be seen, so no hanging around the front lobby because we didn't want them to be put in a position where it would become an agitation to anyone. But you have to prepare yourself should those events occur. But I think that for the most part, things are, and even from the perspective of the officers in the soft uniforms being one layer, that second layer being the officers on the bicycles. And being on a bicycle, you don certain protective equipment just for purpose of riding the bicycle. So that became the second level. The third level was the officers that rode the motorized bicycles. There's a certain level of protection that they would naturally wear just riding those motorcycles. So we kind of staged those 4 levels throughout the footprint to make sure that we had the proper response at the proper time.
And I guess which brings up the cost issue, which a lot of agencies need to accept, that it is expensive to respond appropriately to
Yes.
these type of events, and we need to plan for that.
Yes.
If I can just add one quick comment on that. One thing that I learned too in handling these things, there may be a time when you have to bring out officers that are dressed in different equipment because of what's going on, but it's important to de-escalate as soon as possible.
Correct.
Once the situation has been resolved, pull them off the line and replace them with officers that are back in the soft look to de-escalate the crowd, de-escalate the tensions, and everything else. So we talked about de-escalation in another context earlier. It's equally important during a mass demonstration. If you do have a little bit of an outbreak, de-escalate it as soon as you can.
And if I could just add to that, what was really critical to our success was training as a team and having command and control and knowing where all of those staged resources were. Because on the 5th day of the NATO summit was when we got into the confrontation where our lines got attacked by, I'm not going to call them protesters because they weren't, they were agitators. And initially, they started throwing rocks and bottles, and we went from, the line was in front of me, in front of the stage where the Afghanistan war veterans were throwing their medals back at the NATO summit. There was a stage and there was an event. As soon as that finished, they started throwing rocks and bottles at us. We went to the helmets, and we brought out a different line, and I was standing on a planter behind our officers looking out into the crowd. And right after we got the helmeted officers in front of us, it was really phenomenal to watch because these individuals had obviously trained and practiced their assault techniques because they locked arms and they started coming forward in a fashion where they were chanting, 1 step, 1 step, 1 step. And that was time when we said, okay, let's get the guys out here who are dressed properly. And we barely got them on the line when they hit the line to the point where I was holding up officers personally from behind because that's where the surge came and it hit right in front of me. But then we got it reinforced very, very quickly. So the teamwork, working as a team, knowing where those officers were at all times and deploying them quickly is really critical because we could have gotten caught in between with the wrong officers out there at that time.
We have 2 more comments or questions. Sue Rohr and then Tracy Mears.
This is for Kristina. I would like to get the point of view of a demonstrator on this. I don't have recent experience with a mass demonstration. Mine goes back to 1998. The WTO started out as demonstrations, turned to riots in Seattle. And one of the dilemmas we had was anarchists coming in from outside that had really tried to take everything off track. And from the perspective of somebody who is legitimately protesting a particular issue, what words of advice would you have for the police department trying to manage that? How can we work in partnership with the people who are trying to get their message out there? And you've got these, in our case, it was anarchists coming in. I think each demonstration probably has a different group that might do something like that.
Certainly. So within the current demonstrations that are taking place nationwide, one of the core principles is that people of color are in the leadership positions. So often what I've noticed is when you see anarchists, they're wearing potentially masks, so they're very distinguishable from the crowd. This is going to sound like a gross generalization, but on a local level, we've noticed that they're disproportionately white and male. So you'll see that the white allies who are supporting the people of color, who are in leadership, who have an agenda, have speakers, and then you'll sort of see people on the periphery who are in proximity with the group, but not necessarily in tangent. So it always helps for us to have clergy around, regardless of your belief level or your non-belief level. They tend to be good point of contacts in terms of de-escalating situations. So for me, I think that's incredibly beneficial. And then communicating with some of the more obvious leadership who are probably making note of the same things. So the last march that I participated in, the person, or excuse me, the chief said, "Hey, you have a bullhorn," so I take it you're in charge. I said, "Oh, okay, I guess I just got deputized." But he initiated the communication to begin with, so that was incredibly helpful. I'm not sure if he agreed or disagreed for whatever reason we were there, but he said, "Just to let you know, my guys are right there, and if you need anything, come talk to me." So that was incredibly helpful to make sure that there's an open line of communication regardless of what the protest is about. And in the event that he notices something or I notice something, we both can talk to each other. So hopefully that answered.
So you become allies in a sense to keep your demonstration on track.
Certainly, because and then there's the media portion, and I do think that police are incredibly sensitive to the way in which protests are being depicted in the media right now, just as protesters are, because there's disproportionate, there's messaging issues on both sides in terms of protesters being agitators or oppositional to police in general, and then police being agitators or oppositional to First Amendment protests as well. So it is a weird sort of parallel.
Thanks. Well, thank you. Tracy Mears.
Sue Rare's question was not my question, but Ms. Brown's answer answered the question I had, so.
Good.
I feel your pain.
Well, let's join in thanking this terrific panel.